The G7 summit, where the G7 leaders have vowed that attempts to weaponize trade and supply chains would fail and face consequences. In a thinly veiled warning to China over its economic practices, the group said in a statement that did not directly mention China, I'm quoting, attempts to weaponize economic dependencies by forcing G7 members and our partners, including small economies, to comply and conform will fail and face consequences. As per the U.S. National Security Advisor John Kirby, new measures will focus on setting up more resilient supply chains for the G7 countries, which rely heavily on China in some sectors. He said there is a desire for a stable relationship with China and working together on issues on mutual interest. The G7 wants to preserve its economic ties with China. It does not seek to hamper China's economic progress and development. The G7 leaders are simply attempting to reduce excessive dependence on China when it comes to critical supply chains. An EU official also said the aim of all G7 leaders is to say that China has followed a systematic policy of acquiring critical raw materials and controlling supply chains. And we are responding to this by diversifying. Now, despite the statement, the US has been aggressively pushing to restrict China's access to advanced chip manufacturing tools, citing national security concerns. It has also pressed Japan and the Netherlands to follow suit. And in the final communique issued at the G7 summit, the leaders said, ensuring economic resilience and economic security globally remains the best protection against the weaponization of economic vulnerabilities. The group said it will engage in dialogue and follow a cooperative approach within the G7 as well as with partners beyond the G7 and globally, including in collaboration with the developing countries. Meanwhile, China responded saying it is gravely concerned about the recent signs of negative, quote-unquote, China-related moves at the G7 summit. It urged Japan to not turn the G7 summit into a political show against or to curb China. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Hiroshima. He is scheduled to meet the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is the first time the two leaders will be meeting since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And going straight across now to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibul, who's with us from Hiroshima. He's been tracking all those updates coming in. Siddhant, get us up to speed with the latest at this point.
Well, so far we have seen multiple bilaterals of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in respect to the Prime Minister's visit here, and of course he participating in the outreach summit, a summit which saw participation of all the 8 invited countries. Now, in terms of the larger context, the G7 context, we saw the joint statement being released, and on expected lines, strong statement against both Russia and China. On China, of course, the G7 countries have been saying that while nobody wants to thwart the growth of China, China needs to follow rules-based order. The remarks coming in the backdrop of the Chinese aggressive actions in the region with countries like Japan. So all in all, it has been a productive day, but the day is still yet to be completed. There are other engagements, including the much anticipated meeting between the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and the Quad summit, which was supposed to happen in Australia but is now happening here in Hiroshima.
Right, Siddhant, what are the next a few hours going to look like? Of course, we will see the meeting taking place between the Indian Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President, a highly anticipated meeting. We also saw those visuals coming in of the Indian Prime Minister with the American President.
Well, we've just got the information that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Ukrainian President Zelensky have met on the sidelines of the G7. This is the big story coming right now. This is now confirmed that the leaders have met. This is the first in-person meeting between the two leaders since the conflict started last year. There have been multiple times telephonic conversation, but an in-person meeting is something that everyone was waiting for. We are still awaiting the first visuals of that meeting and also what transpired between the two leaders. But essentially, we know that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been calling for the end of the conflict. He last year told the Russian President Vladimir Putin that this is not an era of war. And since then, these comments have reverberated, with several foreign leaders also referring to these comments of the Indian Prime Minister.
All right, we're leaving it there for the moment. Sidhant, thanks very much for those updates.